There you go.
The Arab Spring was a series of revolutions in which rebel forces attempted to overthrow their autocratic governments. Many of these revolutions were successful, and their revolutionary spirit is spreading out of the Middle East and into Africa. However, in Africa, this revolutionary spirit is manifesting itself in the form of rebel militia groups that are Islamist extremists and are causing violence throughout Africa as a whole. But these rebel militia groups are starting to take power in all of these nations. But unlike the Arab Spring, these rebel militia groups will cause violence and won't allow peace in the nation and won't set up democracy. But considering that Islamist extremism rising in Africa could become terrorist groups and become a threat to U.S. national security, it's imperative that we ask today's question. What steps should the international community take to stop the spread of violence in Africa? And the answer is we need to do three things. First, we need to stabilize their governments. Second, we need to provide troops. And lastly, we need to provide humanitarian aid. But let's first take a look at how we need to stabilize the governments. Half the reason that these militias are so powerful is because there is no government strong enough to keep them from becoming powerful. In order to reduce the power of these rebel militia groups, we need to stabilize the governments, giving them a force that they must fight against, and giving them opposition. We see that one of the problems is in Mali. The New York Times of January 3rd, 2013 explains that in Mali, back in 2011, their government was overthrown by a military coup. And now, the northern half of Mali, an area larger than France, is controlled by 3 rebel militia groups. These militia groups have seen virtually no opposition since they got rid of the government in 2011. And in order to make them have an opposition and give peace to Africa, we need to start stabilizing the government. Now, we need to do so in other nations as well. The conflict is not only in Mali, but it's in Algeria and Congo. In fact, the BBC of January 25th, 2013 explains that in Congo, M23 rebels have taken over the city of Goma and are on their way to taking over the nation as a whole. But in order to stabilize these governments, the United Nations needs to start providing diplomats. We need to start putting our diplomats into these governments. And as weak as they may be, once the United Nations starts implementing their version of government, these governments will get stronger. And although this government may not be the best fit for the African regions, any government is better than no government. And this government would provide an opposition to the Malian and Algerian and Congolese rebels. But we see that providing stability to governments is not enough. We must also provide troops. See, troops have the same function as stabilizing governments does. It's another layer of opposition to the rebels in Africa. Now let's take the look of Algeria. The New York Times of January 13th, 2013 explains that Algerian rebel groups have been able to take hostages in Algeria and have killed 37 Algerians. So what we need to do is what the French did in Mali. The New York Times of January 13th, 2013 explains that the French government started providing troops in Mali, and these troops have been combating violence. Their main goal was to first get rid of the current conflict, but their goal now is to stop any conflict from occurring in the future. Now what the French are doing is what the international community needs to do in Africa as a whole. And the international community has recognized that. The BBC of January 13th, 2013 explains that the United Nations has pledged to provide 18,000 troops and 2,500 peacekeepers to Africa as a whole. By providing such huge numbers in troops, we see that the rebel groups now have an opposition that they need to fight against. And by doing this, providing troops would promote peace in Africa and reduce the spread of violence. Now let's lastly realize how providing troops is not enough. We must provide humanitarian aid as well. See, rebel militia groups basically force the civilians in these nations to join the groups, saying that if they don't come with them, the militia groups will fight against them. So the civilians are scared into working with the militias. But if we start providing humanitarian aid to the people will start working for us and not against us. The New York Times of January 13th, 2013 explains that that's exactly what we're going to do in Algeria. See, in Algeria, we recognize the hostage situation that occurred. But in order to prevent this violence from escalating, we need to start providing humanitarian aid. And we see that if we don't, the situation in Algeria, Mali, and Congo could turn into what happened in Nigeria. The Guardian of January 30th, 2013, explains that in Nigeria, violence has been going on since 2009, and Boko Haram, an Islamist extremist group, has killed 3,000 Nigerian citizens. If we don't start providing humanitarian aid now, these groups will become even more powerful, and the situation in nations like Mali, Algeria, and Congo will easily turn into what happened in Nigeria. Providing humanitarian aid would force the people to be on our side and not work against us. So in returning to today's question, what steps must the international community take to combat the spread of violence in Africa? We see that they first must stabilize the government. Second, provide troops. And lastly, provide humanitarian aid. If we do all three things, we see that like the Arab Spring promoted democracy in the Middle East, we see that the African Spring would promote peace.